let's see. Okay, I see it's actually working, but there's a bit of a lag on my end.
Yeah, there will be some lag on both of our ends, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll hear ourselves in real time, but the video is going to be lagged on YouTube.
All right, well then let's start.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, there's already a few people, so that's good. So hi everyone. Thank you for joining us. I've never done a live on YouTube before, so it's really exciting. And I'm here with Donald from The Revolution Report. And we're going to talk about an upcoming interview that he has because it's really interesting. But first, let's introduce ourselves. Most of you know I'm LadyIzdihar. I go by LadyIzdihar on the internet. I'm a historian and a historical researcher. I cover Eastern Europe and Russia. And Don, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, my name's Donald Corder. I'm from America, but I live in Moscow, Russia right now. I have my own YouTube channel, The Revolution Report, where I basically make videos translating information from the Russian sphere of information into the English sphere. So you can find out the perspectives of actual Russians living in Russia, and not just Russians, but basically people from all over the post-Soviet sphere. I'm doing right now a documentary in Donbass, which is a breakaway. They recently broke away from Ukraine in 2014. And the subject of our discussion, of course, is Sazhi Umalatova, who is Chechen in origin. So, yeah, that's basically what I do here. And I'm also a journalist. So.
And where can we find you on the internet?
You can find, I have a website. I'll put all the links in the chat right now. So here's a link to my website, the Revolution Report website, and I'll post my channel also, the link to the channel in the chat. You could also follow the Revolution Report on Instagram. We have a new Instagram channel, and we're gonna also be opening a TikTok, so we'll have some information there soon as well.
Yeah, that'll be really good. A lot of people need that perspective, your perspective on things from that sort of quick and easy platform is definitely lacking.
Yeah, especially because I think in the English-speaking world, there's a dominance of anti-communist voices, just because we don't know exactly what the people who really supported socialism in the USSR were thinking, because a lot of them weren't really thinking to translate it into English. Didn't really care what the anti-communists thought. So.
Yeah, it's also a platform that really likes sensationalized topics. So even people who are in Russia tend to just play off of what what they're gonna get views from Americans as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm looking forward to that. And of course, you can. My links are on this channel as well, and I'm on TikTok as LadyIzdihar, and on Instagram as LadyIzdihar. And if you just type in LadyIzdihar, you'll find me on various places, and hopefully nowhere problematic where I'm being discussed by others. So yeah, tell us about this interview that you're going to be airing and when it will be up for us to watch.
Sure. Well, so the person I interviewed, her name is Sazhi Umalatova, and I'll get more into who she was, why she was important, and everything later on. But at Russia Today, that's where I work, we're doing a special 30 years after the fall of the USSR. So we're making some sort of TV special that's going to show the perspectives of people who went through Perestroika, through the fall of the USSR, and what they think 30 years later. And part of that, actually, management at work specifically asked me. I'm like the Soviet expert at work, so they're like, "Who should we interview?" And I was like, the first person that comes to mind who's still alive is Sazhi Umalatova. So we went and did an interview with her, and about 30-minute interview. And I decided that I'm going to translate it all on my own, and also put it on my YouTube channel with a little bit of an introduction to what perestroika is, and about how you know, there's actually two sides to the perestroika story, because usually we're just taught that perestroika was about freedom and the fall of communism, and everyone loved it, nobody hated it, but that's not true actually. So the interview probably it's definitely gonna be out by the end of the month, I think. It just takes a lot of work, especially because I'm working on this Donbass documentary right now, but I still have to translate the video and put together the rest of the components of the video about perestroika as well.
Right. I mean, that is a lot to do all of the translating yourself, so I think it's understandable that it might take a little while. But
yeah.
Yeah, so what can you tell us about Sazhi exactly?
Okay, so Sazhi, she was born in Kazakhstan. She was actually part of the Chechen diaspora that was deported during World War II. A lot of people know there were a number of deportations of peoples during World War II, connected to you know, the possible formation of a fifth column in the USSR when this terrible war was going on, and basically in terms of national security at the time. But she was she was born in Kazakhstan. Her parents are from Chechnya, and she was basically first actually a deputy of the People's Soviet in Grozny, which is the capital of Chechnya. She started her political career there, and she eventually became a deputy of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. And the Supreme Soviet of the USSR is basically like the Congress of the United States, but in you know, the Soviet Union. And she basically gave a speech in 1990 at the Congress, the last Congress, if I'm not mistaken, of the Supreme Soviet in the USSR, where she came out in opposition to Gorbachev's perestroika policies, his glasnost policies, and she basically said that he's destroying the country. You know, she stood up in front of the entire Congress and said this. And actually, if anyone watching right now wants to see for themselves what she did, I'm going to put the links in the chat right now. So that's a link to her actual speech that I just put during the Congress of the Supreme Soviet. And actually, this link right now is an RT documentary on the fall of the USSR. So this documentary, I think, is really good. It shows both sides of what happened during the fall of the USSR. You know, the people who were happy about it, the people who didn't like it. And Sazhi Umalatova has another interview in that documentary. So I would definitely suggest watching it. It's very interesting.
Mm. Yeah, and I find her like personally interesting, being like, because she is a Chechen woman, and Chechnya is such an interesting place. In fact, I want to talk a bit about what Chechnya is and why it's so. Well, first of all, people are always surprised to hear, oh, like women had a place in the government, right? Like, I guess she would be more of what you would call a legislator, right? Because she was part of the legislative body of the English, or the Chechen English ASSR, right?
Yeah.
And this region of southern Russia is really historically and geographically significant. Just if you look at a map, I don't have a map to show you, but if you look at a map, it is a very important strategic point, and historically has always been an important strategic point for many, many empires. Russia has a long history of trade between empires of the East, and that would primarily go through the Caucasus region. And because of this, the indigenous people there have always had a complex relationship with various empires. This is also interesting as it pertains to religion. Most people in this region of the North Caucasus accepted Islam in the 15th century, though some had accepted it earlier. And prior to that, they were, like many indigenous people in what is now Russia, shamanistic pagans. And their version of Islam is really unique because they have incorporated various aspects of their more shamanistic pagan past into the way that they practice Islam. But of course, religion has also played into the complexities of their relationship with others. But to see someone like her represents like a legislative body within the Soviet Union, I think is really important to help people understand the actual ethnic and religious diversity of that region.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I wasn't able to find anywhere on the internet, an actual declaration of what religion she follows. But she was, like I said, she was born into a Muslim family, and she regularly, defends the historic legacy of religion and its impact on progressive movements in the USSR and in the Soviet Union as well. She herself is very religious, and she was a member of the Supreme Soviet of the entire country. A lot of
Mhm.
times when people think about the USSR, they say that the country was state atheist or something. They usually use the state atheist term as opposed to secularism to denote like state enforcement of atheism, like not allowing people to follow their religions. But in this interview with Sazhi Umalatova, she says that she was religious throughout the entire throughout her entire life in the USSR. Even in the video that I put in the chat, where she gives her speech against Gorbachev, she mentions God several times in her speech, and that was completely acceptable. She also in our interview, actually, when I asked her about religion, I asked her like, what was religion. What was religious tolerance like in the USSR? Because a lot of people in the West think that the government just didn't allow people to believe anything in terms of religion. And she was like, I don't even know how that myth came to be, because I was a believer throughout the entire history of the USSR when I was alive. And also, she mentioned that there are actually cathedrals within the boundaries of the Kremlin, and they were active during the Soviet period. When that was the center of power of the Communist Party. There were cathedrals there that were having masses. They were having services, and people went there. And you can even see in the Congress in the Congress that Sazhi Umalatova is talking. There are actually religious figures in the audience, so they had their place in Soviet society.
Yeah, and like regardless of her personal practice, whether it's there or not, or what she identifies as, she is still representing a historically and significantly still religious community of the English and Chechen people during her
Yeah.
time as a legislator. So that in itself says a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe like a lot of the myth does just come from flat out Red Scare propaganda. A lot of the scare tactics coming out of the U.S. towards the Soviet Union were to identify them as godless. So of course, that has a lasting effect in our
Yeah,
perception.
absolutely. It also unfortunately has an effect on people who are even coming to socialist ideology or history of the Soviet Union, in approaching it in a positive way, and they're trying to learn more about it. And a lot of people who are doing so actually inadvertently fall into these uh, anti-communist propaganda tropes from the Cold War, unfortunately, like, people who might consider themselves socialists but are entirely against any possible religious belief. And this was not even how the Bolsheviks acted in the USSR. This was not how
Right.
real communists acted. It's kind of similar to how, we talk about collectivization, industrialization as, forced uh, forced things that the government just forced on everyone, when it's much more nuanced than that. It was, they were struggles within society between two classes, and it wasn't just the state oppressing people, to get things done.
Yeah, exactly. And that also kind of plays into the next question I have is why haven't many of us heard of her? Do you think her being from Chechnya or being a Chechen woman has an effect on that? Or what's your take on why perhaps we in the West and the English speaking world have never heard of her or her words haven't been translated? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think the reason is primarily twofold. I think the main reason is because she's anti-perestroika and that she's a communist. I think mainstream academia has a bias against pro-communist stances throughout the USSR, because there was, I mean, the USSR was not a socialist country through oppression. I mean, it was a socialist country because it had the majority support of the people throughout the vast majority of its existence. And even when the Soviet Union was collapsing, there was a referendum that asked people from all over the Soviet Union, do you want to retain the USSR, the Soviet Union, the unity of peoples of these republics? And they voted overwhelmingly yes, even in 1991. So I think mainstream academia has doesn't want really people to know about these people who were outspoken pro-communists who opposed what Gorbachev was doing, specifically during the fall of the USSR. I mean, she was a woman, and she was a religious woman in the USSR who was a powerful Soviet politician. And this brings me to the second point. I think a lot of times in the current mainstream political trend right now, especially in academia, is heavily centered on identity politics. But most of that is actually anti-communist. They also at the same time say that, but the USSR was anti-Semitic and women didn't really have rights and everything. But this is actually a clear example that this assertion is false. Like you said, this woman was a minority in the USSR, and she made waves throughout society that are still heard to this day. I mean, everyone in Russia basically knows about Sazhi Umalatova. She's almost just as important as Gorbachev in this period for people in the ex-Soviet sphere. So I think that it's both of those reasons. The fact that she's a communist and she doesn't, as a minority, she doesn't fit the frame that mainstream identity politics and academia want her to fit. And this doesn't only have to do with Sazhi Umalatova, because there were also a lot of people who were similar in the Perestroika era who opposed Gorbachev, who opposed Perestroika, who wanted to continue the path of socialism, but to make it better. A couple names I can share with you are Nina Andreeva. I'm sure almost nobody in the English world knows about her, and a lot of people in the Russian world know about her. She was a chemistry teacher, actually a chemistry professor in the USSR in Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, and she wrote a scathing article in the media against Gorbachev, against Perestroika, and she became famous in the USSR for a while. There's also Yegor Ligachov. He was basically the leader of the informal kind of anti-Gorbachev opposition, and he was eventually, essentially purged from the party after Gorbachev, suspected him of disloyalty, but he didn't even actually do anything. There's also the more well-known event that took place, which was the August coup. It was basically, the coup d'état of Gorbachev. It was the last attempt of the anti-perestroika movement to take him out of power, and that was Gennady Yanayev. He led that. These people aren't really talked about in Western academia when they think about perestroika. And I personally, even in university, I studied history, and I wrote my senior thesis on Nina Andreeva. And the article that she wrote, it was called "I Can't Renounce My Principles." She saw that she was an ardent communist, and she wasn't like a party boss or anything. She was just a chemistry teacher, a chemistry professor at a university in Leningrad, and she saw that like all around her, society was turning into something that was not socialist, even though it was purporting itself to be socialist. And she felt a responsibility to to talk about this in the media. And I wrote my senior thesis on that, and I was like, I was running into obstructions with the staff in the history faculty of my university at every step, because they just were not comfortable with this topic. They wanted me to write something apolitical, like the role of so and so in the American Revolution, or something that's not relevant to today. And the fact is that the fall of the USSR is super relevant to today, even though it happened still 30 years ago. The West said that it was supposed to be the end of history. They said that this is it, democracy, capitalist democracy won, socialism will never come back. And we see now that socialism is becoming more and more popular in the United States 30 years later. It's like the specter of communism, as Marx put it, is still haunting Europe and the United States. So.
Yeah, and I noticed like you even sound frustrated just like thinking about your experience in writing about these things as well. And I think there's like a huge misconception on traditional academia that if you are a researcher connected to a college, or if you're getting whatever, if you're getting your degree and doing this sort of official research, that you can talk about whatever you want. But there is a lot of pressure, and the resources available in the English language, as you know, is just very, very minimal, because not only are there biases in the person doing the research or writing on these things, there's a bias in the translation and what gets translated and what doesn't, and what's easily accessible and what isn't. And I know that you now know Russian quite well, and you do a lot of reading in Russian, and I'm sure you could maybe talk a bit about just I'm just interested in this, about maybe the difference you saw once you had the linguistic access to more resources on these topics that you were not able to access before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have to agree with you 100% about the translation, about the bias of people, historians, even in official academia, because you can have whatever degree you want. Sorry, my cat is coming on the camera. You can have whatever degree you want, but if you don't speak another language that's relevant to your field of study, and you've only been around, for example, people who defected or are the descendants of people who defected from the USSR, then you're only ever going to get that perspective. You're never going to be able to talk to the majority of people actually who stayed in the USSR because they had a good life. So that's actually the main reason why I learned Russian. And at this point, I mean, I've been studying Russian I studied Russian for 4 years in university, and I immediately came to Russia afterwards. And after 4 years of living in Russia, I think it's safe to say that I speak it pretty fluently at this point. And the difference I noticed is that basically you can read about both perspectives when you know the Russian language as well. You can understand, the perspective of the anti-communist liberals, and that's also published in Russian, obviously, because they won the Cold War. But you can also read the perspective of the people who actually supported the Soviet Union, who supported socialism, and understand that they were actually in the majority for the vast majority of the history of the USSR. And these ideas actually that are considered outrageous in America, like possibly thinking that Stalin did anything correctly or that anything good in the USSR even existed, or the works of Grover Furr, if anyone knows about those, about his works, they're all considered absolutely ridiculous in mainstream academia in the United States. But in Russia, they're actually considered like a mainstream opinion. It's pretty mainstream, like if you tell someone you're a communist in Russia, they'll kind of relate to you in the way as if you said you were a Democrat in the United States. It's just considered a legitimate political stance that some people agree with and some people don't. And that's the difference. I think it's because people grew up in a society where where all the information is available from both sides. And in the United States, we don't have that. We have I think, a mistaken conception that everything was just bad. And one of the things that showed me this was the fact that in the USSR, most anti-communists, they'll say, "Oh, well, you didn't live in the USSR, so you don't know what it was like," and everyone who lived under it hated it. But one of the first things I did with my channel was go up to absolutely random older people on the street in Russia and ask them about their lives in the USSR. And all of them had something, overwhelmingly positive things to say about it. And they weren't even political people. I asked them some political questions, and all of them were like, well, I wasn't a politician. I was just an average person, so I can't talk about the political aspect, but my life there was, good. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I like how you mentioned also, like, if the only people you're talking to are the diaspora or those who immigrated to the U.S. While the Soviet Union was still around, of course you're going to have this bias of the people who had some sort of reason to want to leave. And
mhm.
then it's strange how we organize our value of whose opinion matters when we don't even have access to everything. It sounds like simple
Yeah,
concepts, right? Like you can, of course, those who moved are going to have a certain perspective or a bias on things. Of course, academia is going to be filtered through a political lens because our universities are, funded through the government. So of course, right? But
right. Yeah.
surprisingly, people don't think about this until they learn another language, and all of a sudden you have all this access to different perspectives. So that's
Yeah.
another reason
And
why your interview is going to be really interesting because it's a whole window into something a lot of us wouldn't have otherwise had access to.
right. And another problem I see, that I've noticed is that a lot of people like judge their understanding of what socialism was like in the USSR by hearsay, like
Mm.
my grandmother lived there and she hated it. My mother lived there and she hated it. But there's people who hated it and loved it. I could say the same thing for people you know, here in Russia, basically everyone has like a communist grandmother, so or grandfather. So it's important for people to understand that like we can't just understand history through our own personal experiences, because we're all individuals and we all have, to a certain extent, a bubble we live in and our own biases. And that's why it's important to, take these steps to actually understand what was going on, to read books and articles and talk to people who were actually involved in certain events to understand all the perspectives of the event in question.
Yeah, and history is like just as much about understanding facts and sequences of events as it is about understanding politics and understanding
Yeah,
psychology. Like one of the interesting things is, there's all sorts of types of survivor biases, or there's a huge wave of Russian immigrants to the U.S. moving back to Russia, or there's people
yeah,
who move and then they realize like this isn't what I thought it was, but I can't go back, so it's the easiest, to demonize the past. Of course, that's not always the case, and there are, of course, people who didn't have wonderful lives, but understanding that those events and instances are cherry picked for a narrative when it comes to academia is really important.
yeah. And it's also, and adding on to that, it's also important to understand that Western propaganda in the USSR and right now in Russia is a very real thing. There's tons of people who have an idolized idea of what America is like because they watch Hollywood movies. One popular one is like Sex in the City. A lot of people think like everyone in New York is like rich and just like loving their life and everything. This misconception is still here in Russia, even though it's something probably a lot of people thought was probably more likely the case in maybe the 1990s. But people, like you said, people think that America is like heaven, and then they go there and then they're disappointed, because they realize that it's just actually another place with its own problems. So
Hmm. That's always something interesting to mention to people because, of course, another common critique is like, oh, you're romanticizing the Soviet Union or you're romanticizing Russia.
right.
And understanding that the romanticization of the US also exists in these places is often
Yeah.
eye opening for people.
Yeah, and it's a lot of times a lot stronger than socialists' romanticization of the USSR.
Yeah. So let's talk more about Saji because that's what we're mainly here to talk about. But
Yeah,
what do you think makes her the most remarkable? What exactly did she do that makes her such an important person?
that's a really good question. And for those watching, to learn more about that, I would again suggest the RT documentary because she talks about in that interview exactly what I'm about to say. Uh, she was brave enough to stand up to Gorbachev in front of the entire Congress of the Communist Party in 1990 when, Gorbachev his policies were going full speed ahead, and basically anyone before that moment in time was powerless to do anything about it. She was brave enough to stand up in front of the entire Congress and give an impassioned speech saying that this guy is ruining the country, and she demanded his resignation in front of the entire Congress. And she gave a long speech demanding it. They tried to cut her off. She was like, "Don't cut me off," and she stood her ground. And in the interview with RT, she even says that when she finished the speech, she was walking down the aisle and she saw, like, grown men crying. There were hundreds or thousands of people in that hall that she gave a speech to, and there were like a number of grown men crying because they knew that everything that she was saying was correct, but they didn't have the guts to do anything about it. They were too afraid. And that I think was one of the main defects of the Communist Party at the time. Like nobody, like the kind of bravery that existed during the Great Patriotic War and even after was not there anymore. And that's one of the reasons, that these opportunistic elements of the party and society were able to take over and create the horror that was privatization in the 1990s. But she was tough enough to stand up even when nobody stood up with her, to do that. And she said actually that she after she gave that speech, she resigned as a deputy of the Supreme Soviet. She said, "I can't work in this government as long as it's following the lead of Gorbachev." So that to me is just amazing. She, like Nina Andreeva, another fantastic Soviet woman, they weren't going to give up their principles just because it was difficult, and that's what makes her extraordinary, I think.
And so to clarify, was she the only one to speak out at this time?
So there were a number of people who spoke out at different times, but at this specific Congress, she was the only one, and she was definitely the one that got the most sympathy. Because there were a couple other people who gave speeches against Gorbachev's policies in years before, but none of them gave such an impassioned speech and actually called for his resignation. That was considered like a kind of a breach of party discipline. But in reality, the person who was in breach of party discipline was Gorbachev, and someone needed to do something about it. So, but she was the only one willing to do that.
And so you met her. Like, do you feel like there's something like special about her that made her able to do this?
Well, she's definitely a very unique person. She's very outspoken. She's a very strong woman. And that much was clear when I met her. I always feel like there's like people grew up differently in the USSR than they do now in Russia. I mean, there's still a lot of the Soviet legacy of society that is in Russia, but a lot of it has already been westernized. But in the USSR, there was like a very specific type of woman, I would say. It's like a woman who was raised in a society that told her that she was equal to men, that she could do anything a man could do, and she had the same exact opportunities. And that's what Soviet equality meant. A lot of times we hear this myth about the USSR that everyone was paid the same, because they hear that they hear that the Soviet Union was equal, and they just get this idea in their head. But that's not actually what Soviet equality meant. There were people who made different salaries, and it was dependent on the quality and quantity of their work. And in the USSR, what equality meant was that a woman had the same opportunity to get the same amount of money as men for the same quality and quantity of work. And because this economic understanding exists, it spreads to all different spheres of life, I would say. She quoted poetry several times. She's like super highly educated. I don't know anything about poetry, but she is obviously very cultured, very smart. She reads it, but she's very she understands what's going on in the world in terms of politics, and she still is active in political life. Like, she is the founder of the party of, if I'm not mistaken, it's called the Party of Peace and Unity. Yeah, and that party's still active. They're like they support the Putin government, and she's very active in that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought that the name of the party that she ended up creating was interesting because looking at like Chechen history, their society was always quite egalitarian, so it's almost fitting, as well as her strong-headed attitude. I think it's quite reminiscent of the stereotypes of her region as well.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask, what exactly did she say in her famous speech, and what were her stances specifically that she was speaking so passionately about?
Well, for example, the link that I shared in the chat, it's in Russian, so people who don't speak Russian will have to watch with English subtitles. But the title says "Он развалил страну." It means he destroyed the country. There were people in the past who disagreed with Gorbachev and said that his policies were leading down the wrong road and everything. But she specifically said, like, Gorbachev is destroying the country, and basically he's basically implying that he's an enemy of the people in what he's doing, and outright called for his resignation. And this just had not been done before. She talks about how that he had committed unconscionable acts by destroying the country, that the social system of society was falling apart. By 1990, there were massive shortages of pretty much everything, and a lot of times, and actually this was not long before the coup, actually, because the coup was in August of 1990, if I remember correctly, and the coup that overthrew Gorbachev and tried to restore, power, and tried to restore power to the Communist Party, basically. I remember when I was doing this interview, actually, my producer told me an interesting story. She said she was actually a pioneer at the time. The pioneers are like the communist youth organization in the Soviet Union. And she said basically everyone hated Gorbachev by 1990 because his policies had led to exactly what Sazhi Umalatova was talking about, destroying the country. Like this is the era, actually, of when there were no food on the shelves. There was no food on the shelves, and people had to wait in long lines for products. And people blamed that on the USSR, but actually it was because of the introduction of market mechanisms and the collapse of power of the Communist Party over the planned economic system. So when the coup happened, actually, my producer told me that everyone in the pioneer camp was cheering. They were like, "Yes, it's finally this guy is gone," And another indication of how wrong Western academia understands the fall of the USSR is that recently there was a study in Russia, and they asked the participants of the study, and it was like it had hundreds of thousands of people who were answered, who were people who responded to this survey, and they asked all of the people who in their opinion is the most hated figure in Soviet history. And I think if you asked most people in the West how they think these people would have responded, they would have obviously said Stalin, but that was not the answer. It was Gorbachev. Gorbachev is the most hated Soviet figure in Soviet history because he is, Stalin is disliked by a lot of people for what they perceive as, what he did in his hand in the repressions, or the mistakes he possibly made in the war. But Gorbachev was responsible for destroying the country, and whatever you think of Stalin, like, most Russians attribute the construction of the country to Stalin. The question is more like, did the ends justify the means for the people who don't like
Right.
Stalin? But for Gorbachev, he didn't create anything. He destroyed everything. There's nothing good he did.
Right. So where did Sazhi end up after the dissolution of the Soviet Union?
Well, immediately after, I'm not actually sure, but in 1996, like I spoke about before, she founded the Party of Peace and Unity, and the reason she named it this way actually, and is in my opinion, and based on the interview I did with her and how she feels about the fall of the USSR and everything, is that the major traumatic element of the fall of the USSR for her was the dissolution of the friendship of the peoples, and the fact that after the fall of the USSR, all of these, in Russian they're called the bratskие narody, brotherly nations, they turned on each other basically, because ultranationalists came to power in places like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. We obviously know that in Chechnya there were 2 wars fought. Basically everything went into chaos when just several years ago these countries were living in peace and in economic unity. So that's exactly why, probably she named the party the Party of Peace and Unity. Those 2 things were most important to her, I think. Obviously, living in an economically stable country like the USSR was also important, but peace and unity to her were very important, I could tell. And that it was pretty traumatic for her that after living for so long in a country where no matter who you were, you were equal. She's from Chechnya and she lived with Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Latvians, Lithuanians. It didn't matter who you were. But now there's chauvinism. There's kind of a distaste for certain. There's a distaste that some people have for certain nationalities of the Caucasus. Xenophobia is a thing now. National chauvinism. All these things were not allowed to flourish in the USSR. Because the official policy of the Soviet government was friendship of the peoples, and there was even a parallel national organ to the Supreme Soviet that we were talking about before. That was called the Congress of Nationalities, in which all different nationalities of the USSR had equal representation, and this was also like a federal legal body of the USSR to ensure that all of the republics had representation in the government. So she's still the head of this Peace and Unity Party, and she's engaged in political activism. She, for example, supported the Crimea coming to Russia in 2014, and she basically takes pro-Russian government stances.
Yeah. So I don't know if my audio is picking up. I don't live alone, so there's like music and dogs in the background. So I apologize if anyone can hear that. I don't have much control over that at the moment. But yeah, and you mentioned like the sort of like stigma that people of the Caucasus have, especially now, and much of that came out of the Chechen wars that immediately followed the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And I wanted to ask if you knew what her stances was on that, but knowing that she has always historically been for like more Russian unity, I think we can imagine.
Yeah, I didn't really have time to touch on Chechnya so much in the interview. Mainly, we talked about her positions on Perestroika and Glasnost, and also how religion was treated in general in the USSR. But she obviously was upset about the outbreak of the wars in Chechnya, and I did read an interview actually that she spoke about, because she was asked about how she feels about the way Putin dealt with the second Chechen war, because obviously the first Chechen war was under Yeltsin, the second one was under Putin. And she feels that one of the reasons she supports Putin is because she feels that it was because of his political maneuvers that it was ended quicker than it could have lasted.
Yeah. And so you already talked a bit about her party that she created. Do you know much about the foundation of the Party of Peace and Unity? I know it was founded in 1996.
Mhm. Yeah, I don't actually know that much about it. I just know that, in Russia, there's two legally registered electoral parties. That's the KPRF, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. They're the second largest party in the entire country, second to Putin's party.
Right.
And there's the Communists of Russia Party, which is, I'm pretty sure, the second largest communist party. And they're also able to run in the elections. The
Mhm.
Party of Peace and Unity doesn't run in the elections. They're not legally registered as an electoral party. I think what they do more is agitation. They agitate around political issues and do community work more than anything.
Yeah, I saw that they give out awards as well
Yeah,
in
yeah, I saw
regarding
that.
peace and unity.
Yeah, yeah, and they hold conferences as well. I saw that there was a very important speech that Sazhi Umalatova gave a couple of years ago at a conference that was organized by the party about the impact of Islam and Christianity on Russian history, actually. So,
Interesting.
yeah.
So, how would what do you think her impact overall is on Russian history in Soviet and Russian history, and how is she remembered by Russians today? Like, is she talked about a lot? I know you touched a little bit on this.
Yeah, if you look her up on like Yandex, for example,
Yeah.
there's stuff all about her. She's definitely very well known in Russia. Even even at work at work yesterday in preparation for this interview, I asked I couldn't find something definitive as to like how like what Sazhi Umalatova's religious beliefs are. So I was asking people at work like did you have you heard about it? Do you know blah blah? Everyone knew who she was. Not everyone knew that much about her, but everyone knew who she was. So she's a figure that's known by Russians. Um, I think her impact on Russian history is that of um, is basically that of someone who showed the world that not everyone supported Perestroika, and a lot of Russians even today, even if they're not communists, uh, appreciate that. They like those people because Perestroika, whether you're communist or not communist, it's considered a general tragic period in Russian history, because it not only led to the collapse of communism, but it led to the collapse of the USSR, which most Russians remember as a time when their motherland was very powerful, and also it was the precursor to the privatization of the 1990s that basically nobody looks on favorably. In Russia, it doesn't even matter, what your ideology is. The vast majority of people lost out in the privatization of the 1990s. It was absolute chaos, and it was a terrible, terrible period. I've spoken to a lot of people who say that people our age whose childhood took place in the 1990s, and they say they remember times where they didn't have anything to eat except for bread and water. So uh, it's kind of like what the kind of bread lines and hardship that the Soviet Union is always accused of. That was actually what capitalism was like in the 1990s in Russia. So
Yeah, it's almost as if a lot of the perception by the West has been onto Russia has been immortalized in the state of things in the 90s. I know a lot of
hmm
people still think, yeah, they imagine like the movie Brat, right? Like that's Russia. Even Americans
hmm
know that kind of thing.
yeah.
Um, so I wanted to know, I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, but do they teach about her in schools? Like you said, she's a commonly known figure, and it makes sense that most people would view her positively. But do you know anything about it, her being something mandatory to learn about?
In schools, I'm not quite sure, but I know they do have Soviet history courses in school. and I know that everyone hates them because if unless you have like because they're very difficult courses actually, and in school, and if you don't have an actual interest in Soviet history, it's just really difficult to get through. That's what most people. That's what I've heard from most people. So I'm sure she's there's at least a passing mention of her in Soviet classes in school. Definitely in university, if someone's getting a history degree, that she's definitely in there. Yeah.
And you've never personally encountered anyone with a negative perspective on anything that she did?
No, no, I've never heard anyone say anything negative about her. I mean, because to hear like a negative to hear someone saying like having a negative perspective about her, I think the only reason they would have that would be if they supported Perestroika. And the only people who really support Perestroika are like people who won out as a result of the privatization of the 1990s. You know, oligarchs and people who are significantly well off in Russia right now because of some business practices. You know, uh, and I don't know any people like that. So,
Yeah,
but the vast
that's good.
majority of people, yeah, the vast majority of people, even if they're like not communist, even if they're like liberal, uh, you know, well, maybe not liberal, but even if they're like capitalist but pro-Russian government, they like Sazhi Umalatova.
Mm. So, what are you most looking forward to after the release of your interview with her?
Well, I'm looking forward to my subscribers being able to see a different perspective of Perestroika because we're just taught all the time, you know, that it was this great time period. You know, the thaw and Perestroika are the best time periods of Soviet history because they brought the Soviet Union closer to collapse, which is you know, good for, I guess, liberals in the West, but bad for people who actually lived in this country. You know, so I'm going to be happy for my viewers to see a different perspective because there's very little published about Sazhi Umalatova in English. And I think that's a shame. So I hope this video is going to make a good contribution to that. And also, I'm really excited for people to see her perspective on religion because she's such an ardent communist and she's very religious. And that's something that seems like I'm sure seems like an oxymoron to a lot of communists in the West. And you know, when you're in Russia, you realize that there's nothing contradictory about it. There's plenty of people like that.
Right. Yeah, it seems like.
Even
Sorry.
sorry, I just wanted to add one thing. Even the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which is the second largest party in the country, and the inheritor to the Communist Party of the USSR, they have strong connections to religion and to even the Orthodox Church here in Russia, and they have no problem with religious belief. You know.
Yeah, I mean, I personally have known members who are Muslim who were involved in at least the KPRF in Russia. So, like, it's interesting that it really sucks that from the sort of propaganda put out by the U.S. on the Soviet Union, we now have this like generation of young communists who are simultaneously getting that sort of perspective along with a education on communism and thinking that these things don't go together. When if you just look a little harder as far as the history and representation goes in the Soviet Union, you can clearly see that's not the case, that religion was prominent and that there were religious people involved in the party. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I
it's wonderful to have this example.
yeah. I think again, like it just comes down to unfortunately a lot of people falling into Cold War anti-communist tropes. You know, saying that
Mhm.
the Soviet Union is just like a godless place. I understand. I think the philosophy of dialectical materialism, which is the basis of socialism, uh, steers people into an atheistic direction. I'm an atheist, but that has nothing to do with whether socialists should be, against the existence of religion or not. You know,
Right.
The Bolsheviks, the Communist Party of the USSR, um, always took a position of acceptance to people who believed in religion. What they didn't accept was, religious institutions carrying out anti-government activities, which is something that no government would allow on any country in any country in the world. Like we can talk about, of course, there was a period um, of hostility towards certain aspects of religion in the USSR, especially in the 1920s and the 1930s. But what was the reason for that? The Russian Orthodox Church, aligned itself with the White Armies in the Civil War and counter-revolutionary elements. So, they, as an organization, mobilized against the new Bolshevik government, which is obviously something that the Bolshevik government couldn't tolerate. And when they reconciled, the institution of the Russian Orthodox Church even came back. But even throughout that time period, like if someone was Christian, they weren't killed just for being Christian. That just wasn't the case. And then there was also later after the war, there was the concept of uh, you know foreign religious institutions coming into the Soviet Union, because one thing that a lot of people don't take into account was that there were a lot of churches that were banned in the USSR, and the reason for that was because one of the primary methods that the CIA and Western intelligence agencies were pursuing to conduct espionage in the USSR was through religious organizations, because they have very specific immunities in society. Uh, the government doesn't want to step on the religious freedoms of its people really anywhere. It just it causes problems, and to have Western churches that are doubling as sort of centers of espionage to exist in the country is obviously a national security issue. That's why, like in the USSR, there was a big controversy with the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church said that the Catholic Church in the USSR was being completely oppressed. This was the line of the Catholic Church in Rome. But what was actually going on was that the Soviet government was like, we can have Catholic churches in the USSR. Catholics can practice however they want, but we appoint the bishops, not Rome, because the Pope was completely anti-communist,
Mm-hmm.
and that was a risk, So it's politics. But the people were, ordinary people were allowed to practice their religion. That's a completely separate concept.
Yeah, of course, a lot of the incidences that we hear about that have been translated, have been brought over to the US, are quite cherry picked. I know the closing down or so called destruction of religious buildings is one that is always brought up, when in reality, a lot of that was due to them not being in use or being in villages that were no longer populated due to work expansion, or turned into something that the community needed more relatively, like a community center or something, or so it's always quite easy to explain the reality. And I like to think that because there's so many things cherry picked to make the Soviet Union look bad, it's like it's time that we cherry pick some things. And like this whole thing, like this interview with Sazhi is like a great cherry picked example
Yeah, yeah,
in combatants to that, right?
yeah, yeah. I agree, definitely.
Right. But yeah, I think her whole story really like encapsulates like so many misconceptions in one. That's what makes it so unique and perfect, because there's so much you can pull from that in understanding your own misconceptions.
Yeah, yeah, and it's also important to for people watching it to understand that she wasn't the only person to be in such a position. Islam was practiced in all of the Central Asian and Caucasian Soviet republics. It was practiced throughout the USSR. It wasn't repressed. People were able to practice there, but what was repressed were certain practices, that were unique to those regions. That like for example, there's a famous Soviet movie called Prisoner of the Caucasus, and it's
Yes,
it's a
yes.
it's a satire, but it has to do with the very real tradition in many countries in the Caucasus to, when you want to get married, when a man wants to get married, he steals the person he wants to marry in the middle of the night, and if he can have hold of her until the end of the night and morning comes, then he's allowed to marry her. And the USSR obviously was against this. They thought that this was barbaric and infringed on the rights of women, so they tried to stop this practice. Another thing that was widespread was polygamy in these countries, which the Soviet governments there tried to crack down on. And one thing that's important to note is that a lot of people have the misconception that it was like, maybe Russian communists coming into the Caucasus and doing this, but all of the Caucasian governments had, they had governments made up of the people from those republics,
Right.
and it wasn't like some sort of form of imperialism. Every society has its progressive elements and its reactionary elements, and what the communist parties did was help the progressive elements come into power and develop the country. And the Armenian, like for example, the Armenian communist, the Armenian SSSR, the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic.
Right.
They were that. Yeah, they were. I sometimes forget the names of them in English, to be honest, because I never talk about them in English. They were made up of Armenians. Actually, I knew someone who was Armenian, and she told me that her grandfather was awarded he was in the Communist Party, and he was given an award for the best shashlik in the country, which for people who don't know what shashlik is like shish kebabs. But this was actually something just unique to Armenia because they love shashlik, and these the point is that these traditions are preserved by the communist parties that are run by people in those countries, it wasn't a form of imperialism.
As much as shashlik can be a stereotype for the whole Caucasus region, it is appreciated by all of Russia and the former Soviet Union. There's a lot of shared appreciation for these things that uniquely come from those regions. Yeah, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the structure of government during the Soviet Union as far as like the regional structures go. But yeah, you're right. Like you have local people appointed to positions to represent because it is extremely diverse, not just in its geographic expansiveness, but in its ethnicities. The Soviet Union is over 190 different ethnicities, unique or historically nomadic to the region. So of course, like you have people in positions of power representing these regions, and then they come together. Yeah, there's just a misunderstanding of what that looked like. Everyone thinks there's one person in charge and they control this entire, diverse landscape.
Yeah, it's like it's the concept that like for example, Stalin did this, Stalin did that, Stalin did this, Stalin did that. But the Communist Party was made up of millions of people, and Stalin was the head of he was the general secretary of a Politburo, which had to do with encompassed many people, and they had discussions about things. Collective decisions were made. And sometimes people, if you look at the documents connected to certain historical periods, in discussions, people didn't just like agree with Stalin. They had heated arguments. Actually, what's interesting is that in my research, this trend of like always agreeing with the general secretary actually came up later during the Brezhnev time. They had a crisis of like heated of not having enough discussion within the party. People just got kind of complacent a little bit, but that wasn't the case in like the 1930s, 1940s.
Right. Of course, everything's a lot more average than people want to imagine in their mind. Like, of course, people have disagreements and voice them just like any other political body.
Yeah.
Right. So we have been talking for like over an hour now. So I just wanted to ask if you had any final remarks regarding all of this.
Yeah. Well, I think Sazhi Umalatova is like a great example of why of why it's important to bring stuff from the Russian sphere of information into the English sphere of information, so that people can have the same access to both sides of the argument that people have actually in Russia. You know, there's mainstream YouTubers and bloggers in Russia that that defend the USSR, that have socialist viewpoints. They have, you know, hundreds of thousands of subscribers. It's a much more accepted position here because people just you know, are in a culture that has that point of view everywhere. And in the United States, and even, you know, in Western Europe as well, we don't have that. What we have, and I can say this as someone who studied history and Russian language in university, so I'm familiar with like the makeup of the academic faculties of the Russian departments around the country, and the history department specifically in Soviet history, because actually at my university, Rutgers, it was the second largest Russian faculty in the country. The first is Princeton, and you know, the faculties in both universities work together a lot. What I can tell you is that like the people that are creating you know, the mainstream narratives about Russia and the USSR, they're not even Russian. They're like people, they're Americans that grew up in the United States and decided to like you said, cherry pick the perspectives of super anti-communist people that came from the USSR and Eastern Europe. Like, I mean, I think the biggest example that we can use is Timothy Snyder, who Grover Furr calls out in his book Bloodlands, because he, you know, he makes all of these crazy assertions about the things in the USSR that most people in Russia and even in Eastern Ukraine, which are relevant to his writings, would think are ridiculous. And the reason is because he only cites super ultra nationalist sources, and like sources from people who are like the descendants of Nazi collaborators. You know, these are the sources that are being used by mainstream academia to frame a narrative of what the USSR was like. And it's unfortunate that you need to learn, you know, Russian to really understand, or at least to have the ability to understand all of it. It's a shame because it's really hard just to learn another language. You know, I've been studying Russian for 8 years, and I've lived in Russia for 4 of those years, and I still don't speak perfect Russian. You know, and I can speak it fluently with people and everything, but I still make tons of mistakes, and I don't know words all the words all the time. So and it only gets harder with age as well. So, you know, I've chosen this path for myself, to make this the center of my life. But it seems like if someone doesn't decide to like spend their entire life learning about this stuff, then it's really difficult for them to get both sides, you know.
Yeah, and of course I can relate to much of that. Of course, I come across many, you know, very official, renowned, you know, awarded papers and researches that have been done by, you know, not even just Americans, but even a lot of universities in Central Europe. And it's really upsetting when you look through what they're finding and their sources, and it is extremely biased. And it's often because they go into it with a narrative that they want to portray, and very rarely is the point they're trying to prove something positive, be it because it's not acceptable amongst their faculty or whatever. And that plays a huge role in all of this. But often when people ask me about tips on researching Russia or Eastern Europe, I do say that these days translation apps have become more sophisticated, and it is possible to use them to translate papers, to translate pages, and to search for certain terms. It's just a lot more time consuming, but that is an option for people. Like for myself, I don't speak fluent Russian. I speak very basic Russian, but I can read and write in Cyrillic. And understanding how to read something is really important when you're trying to find certain topics, right? Or even knowing the kinds of terms that you're going to look for, because the terminology and the way people might describe it in the Russian language or just culturally can be something you would have never even thought of. And of course, both of us have spent a significant amount of our lives dedicated to this sort of thing. And through that, you tend to meet people from Russia or with certain connections or perspectives. But of course, the average person isn't going to run into, 12 different Russians with multiple different perspectives on a certain historical event. And so having more people like you out there translating and making this kind of content is really important.
Yeah, especially also because, people who people who lived in Russia or lived in the USSR and had a positive attitude towards it, they're hostile to the idea of the West. They don't want to go to the West. So, if you ask them like, do you want to go to America? They'd be like, no. So then it's obviously understandable why those people would be lacking in capitalist society for anyone to understand the pro-Soviet perspective, definitely.
Yeah, and they don't like feel obligated to do that sort of outreach. Like, why would they?
Right, exactly. And even the communist parties here, they're focused more on internal things than on spreading pro socialist propaganda to the West.
Exactly.
But I think something that can solve this issue is more international cooperation between communist parties and socialist organizations between West and East. That's what I'm trying to do. I mean, I've made a lot of connections in the KPRF. I'm not connected to any one party, but I have a lot of connections to American communist and socialist parties. I've met a lot of people in Russian communist and socialist parties, and I hope I can do something to, bring them together and allow them to cooperate more. So
Right.
I was thinking maybe we could, if you don't have to go, maybe we could answer some questions to people watching in the chat. What do you
Yeah,
think?
of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I know initially there was just someone asking annoying stereotypical questions about Islam and stuff, so I'll just ignore
Yeah.
those.
Yeah, we can ignore those. But it looks like there are some people who are, well, most people here look genuinely interested.
Do you want to pick out some questions to answer?
Yeah, I'm reading this right now. Ariel Rodriguez mentioned Ayn Rand. A lot of people who don't know much about anything about the USSR read her work and her philosophy and take that as gospel about communism. I think that's totally true. I mean, Ayn Rand was terrible. She was like the the perfect example of what the Bolsheviks were trying to do away with. You know. And actually, I was thinking about her political writings about authoritarianism and totalitarianism. I mean, they just have no basis in reality. I've really for a long time wanted to write about these concepts of authoritarianism and totalitarianism. I don't even think they exist. Like of course there are governments that use unjustifiable force in certain moments, but you can't use that as an overwhelming description of any one government. I mean, the United States government does that also. Western European governments do that in certain situations as well. Uh, I think it's just a sort of term to strengthen imperialist propaganda against like countries like Russia or Iran or China. But I for a long time wanted to write like a long book about this because it infuriates me, when there's people casually call like, for example, Russia an authoritarian country. Like, I don't understand what's authoritarian about it. Like
Yeah.
sometimes it seems like, it could be more authoritarian. Like the government could take more of a role in the economy. Sometimes things are actually more laissez-faire here than they are in America. So
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's of course it's also like incredibly dehumanizing towards the population there because it's also like insinuating some sort of mindless group of people that have no perspective, culture, thought to disagree. So I always find those terms really problematic in how they view that entire population and define it by their assumption on what the government is like. And it can also be a philosophical question because to what degree can a person really be controlled by the government as well? So.
Right, right. It is definitely a philosophical question because also you have to wonder like to what extent when you're living in a country that is communist, where the vast majority of society is publicly owned, and the Communist Party, for example, has is involved in everything. To what extent is the individual also part of the Communist Party? Who's oppressing who? They say like the Communist Party is telling people what to do, but at the same time, the people are participating in the the democratic inter-party process. So it's actually just a reflection of people's decisions. I think the biggest example of this, like North Korea, like in the West, so many people just, when they think of North Korea, they think of like a hive of bees. They think of like people who just mindlessly controlled and march in columns all the time and don't have any freedom. When, like you said, I mean, North Korea, Korea in general, is a really has its own unique culture. People have their own unique customs, and they're not just mindless drones.
Right. It's also like, horrifically reflective of a Western perspective on Asia as well, from a very like racist standpoint. You'll find in a lot of these
Yeah.
assumptions, it's just a projection of these sorts of thoughts and simplification, like making things into simple aspects. Simple aspects that they're not as well. So
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
quite problematic. And I think one of the biggest critiques when you say, oh well, they have access to education, they have access to opportunities, they have access to all of these things. How are they restricted to any degree? And people often say, well, you have a limit of what you have access to, but do we not have a limit in the United States to our options and access to things? So anything can really be comparative.
Yeah, absolutely. I just read an article by Slavoj Žižek about this actually, and he says that in brief, the thesis of the article was that the most dangerous form of control is one in which people feel like they're free, and that's exactly what it's like in Western societies. Like we're controlled by the capitalist class. I mean, that's all there is to it. If we don't want to play by their rules, we'll starve.
Exactly.
Oh, but do you know anything about the Serbian protests? That because I don't know actually anything about it.
I think recently there were some issues regarding, I believe it was regarding like climate initiatives and pollution. Like there is a lot of government decision happening right now in terms of extreme pollution in the cities. I'm not super educated on it, but that's what I believe it's surrounding right now.
Oh, okay, yeah,
Yeah.
I wish I could contribute more, but I don't really I'm not really I mean that part of the world is not really my expertise. I'm mostly on Russia and Ukraine, so
Yeah. Uh, it is mine, but I don't always keep up as far as current events go. Historical
mhm,
events, yeah.
yeah,
Cultural context, yeah. But I'm not always up to date on current political things. But yeah, I believe there's something going on in regards
mhm,
to, um, you know, pollutants being allowed that are really harmful to the air quality and the health of the people there. And so there's some
mhm,
outrage right now.
yeah, okay. Yeah, all of this does get mixed up with the vague American concept of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
That's also a problematic thing I was talking about. Like, I mean, the thing I was thinking about how we have these vague uh, Enlightenment era concepts like freedom and liberty, but nobody can define what they are. Even democracy. What does that even mean anymore?
Well, and it's also like an imperialist perspective to try and force our idea of what it is onto other parts of the world and their people and their cultures.
Yeah, yeah, 100%.
Let's see. Any
Yeah,
other
so
questions or comments catch your eye?
it doesn't look like there's any more questions or anything. We could probably end the stream. It's been a long conversation. I hope you found it interesting and all your viewers did.
Yeah. Well, I hope if people didn't manage to catch it, they watch this later and learn something. I think we touched a lot of really important points and perspectives. And hopefully, given that you are in Moscow and you do speak Russian and you have um, experienced all the things you're talking about, I hope it really adds some more legitimacy to these sorts of claims in this sort of sphere on the internet.
Yeah, I hope so too. And I'd be happy to collaborate in the future, of course.
Well, yes, of course. We're definitely going to do more things. Our content and our ideas and our perception on Eastern Europe and Russia definitely align. So, but I'm interested in seeing what other people think about that potential as well.
Yeah. So we'll find out. Solidarity.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to try and turn this thing off, so we'll see how that goes.
Okay.
Yeah. Have a nice night.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.